So some basic concepts. Again, I've talked about the hierarchy, and most of the things, most of the objects in TK interface are referred to as widgets. Specifically, the things that you see on the screen and that you interact with are called widgets. And so a lot of times you'll have a root, and usually this is like sort of what you would think of as the main window of your program. And inside that, you might have one or more what are called content frames or just frames. These frames don't do anything except organize widgets. So they group them in groups and organize them and help you manage all of those widgets. It also, frames can also be used to help uh, organize your layout of your window, which is something you don't often think about until you start building a graphical user interface. We didn't have to worry too much about user interface before, but as you start building these, you'll actually start to see how much we take for granted the way things look on a screen, because there is a fair amount of work involved in making sure that things look right and are easy to use. So inside the content frame, you will have one or more widgets, buttons and text entry boxes and all of those things. So that is how it looks in a flowchart. And in code, a very simple hierarchy might be the root, a single content frame, and a button inside that. And you can see here that the root is actually a TK object, which is the main window. So a lot of times I'll just call this window instead of root, because semantically it just makes sense to me. If you look in the TK documentation, a lot of times they refer to it as a root. I prefer window. It's just an instance of that object, so you can call it whatever you want. You can call it George if you want to. I like to call it window because it makes sense to me. So you'll see I have a content frame here. And again, they call it content. I usually just call it frame 1, frame 2, or left frame, right frame, depending on how many frames I want to have. When I think about how I want to organize my window, I use those frames as sort of the wireframe for it. So I have a frame. So I'm using a TK object dot frame, and the first parameter you always give it is called master, and it's the only required. Well, actually, that's not required. It will automatically default to root if you don't give it one, but I always recommend you always put the master in there. And what you're doing is you're giving it the object that it goes inside. So the frame goes inside the root, and then if I create a button, you can see that the master there is content. So that puts the button inside the content frame, which is inside the window. And that code will actually run. So if I want to take a look at that in code, what I have is a very, very basic, the most basic of all programs. And so what I've imported, you'll see I've got 2 import lines. And I'm not sure why folks tend to use a practice like this, because there does seem to be some redundancy there. But from TK interface, import everything and import TKInter as TK. This is what I will use as my base library to invoke all of the widgets. Okay, so I've got a window equals tk.tk. That doesn't take any parameters, just creates a window. The next one, I'm using window.geometry to change the parameter of the window. I don't know why they use a string here. It's a string that says 600 by 300 or 600x 300. To me, that seems kind of weird, because at some point that's obviously going to be converted to integers. It's pixels. So 600 pixels wide by 300 tall. That's the window space. And then you're going to see something called main loop. And main loop, all it does is set up what's called an event loop, or a TK loop. Basically, it's a forever loop. It's as if we said while true at that point. But what it does is it keeps our program open and waiting for something to happen. Because when we're talking about TK, we actually use a different paradigm of programming called event-oriented program, or event-driven programming. So we have a window that's open there, and it waits for the user to do something. That's not what we're used to, right? What we're used to is something different. So we'll get into that in just a second, but I want to demo this first. So if I run this, there's my TK window. So you can see the window defaults to, I can change this title to anything I want, but you can see here it looks just like any other Mac window that opens up on my computer. It's got the same controls. I can go full screen with it. You can minimize it. It has all of the same properties. And then when I quit that, that's when the program exits. So when I close the window, that's when it exits main loop. I can also stop the program using PyCharm. But that is how we create a basic window. And you can see here, I can easily change the dimensions of the window to 600 by 600, make it a square or whatever. But that is how you start out with TK interface. So the event loop. Event-driven programming is not step-by-step or procedural. That's what we've been doing, where it executes a line of code, then it executes the next line of code, and maybe at some point it pauses and waits for the user to do something, but then it goes right back to just going through the code, doing what it's doing. And there are times and applications where procedural programming makes the most sense. But when you're creating a graphical user interface application, that's really driven by user behavior. So now we're opening up a whole new world where the program is just in a loop while it's running, waiting for the user to do something. Are they going to click a button? Are they going to type something in the text box? Are they going to choose something from a menu? What are they going to do? And how do we deal with that? So the program itself consists of functions or methods that are triggered by events. Events meaning the user does something. So now we have to sort of shift our thinking from the program's going to do this and the users are going to slightly participate, to the user's really in control and can do anything in any order they want, unless we somehow limit it by using different states or different controls on the screen or different things like that. So the event loop is a different idea of programming, and it is very common, but we haven't talked about it yet.